the French and Indian War. So last time was just kind of an introduction to the historiography of the American Revolution. Now we're going to set the stage more in kind of a timeline and reach the showdown between Great Britain and Native Americans, the sides that they took, and obviously the French and Spanish during this conflict. And I think we left off with kind of the agreement that the Iroquois nations, I should say, made after 1700. We call that the Grand Settlement, where they decided, as the 5 Indian nations at the time, there'd be another one added later on, that they were going to remain neutral. Their best chance of survival was to stay out of the conflicts and taking sides in between Great Britain and France, because when they had relied on their English allies, so-called allies, it didn't work very well. They were almost annihilated. They had disease followed by attacks from French and French allied Indians out of Canada across the Great Lakes. The English failed them as far as military allies, and that's why the Iroquois decided we're just going to remain neutral from this point on. So that's the Grand Settlement of 1701. So England and France fought each other 4 times. There's more wars involved. There's some that are involved over there in Europe. But as far as at some point, even on the periphery, affecting the American continent, we're going to talk about a couple of them as we get to the French and Indian War. One of them was called the 9 Years' War, and it had, in Europe, we called it King William's War. These conflicts also had 2 names to make things a little bit more confusing. What we did in the American colonies is we called the war by who was on the throne. This case was King William. This was of William and Mary, by the way. So these were the co-monarchs that were on the throne after the Glorious Revolution in England in 1688 and 1689. And then we had, not long after that, when that war ended, what we called Queen Anne's War. In Europe, they called it the War of Spanish Succession. The idea of who was going to take the throne, would they be able to combine both the French and Spanish thrones together? Again, that wasn't critically important to maybe a lot of people, your average person in the colonies. But again, they named it after the monarch. Queen Anne succeeded Queen Mary after her death. Both conflicts were somewhat indecisive. I mean, the fighting in North America is something of a sideshow, we might say. In King William's War, there were raids led by French and French allied Indians and the frontiers of Massachusetts and in New York. There were raids also into places like Schenectady, the famous Schenectady raid in upstate New York during Queen Anne's War. But fighting in America, for the most part, was a sideshow. And I believe that this would have proven these 2 conflicts, and the fact that, especially in Queen Anne's War, the Iroquois nation stayed out of it. The 5 nations said, look, we're neutral. We kind of lean towards the English for reasons that we're going to explain as we go on today. But we're not going to militarily commit ourselves, because we remain stronger if we are neutral and play the English off against the French, and more advantageous for us. The Iroquois had actually stalled as being allies of the English. The English in areas of New England and New York wanted to actually invade Canada. Again, it was a way to say, okay, our English cousins are fighting back across the Atlantic in Europe. Why don't we fight our French enemies as well? So there was a plan drawn up by some leaders in the American colonies to actually invade areas of Canada, French Canada. It didn't work because the Iroquois proved to be not very, again, it's in their interest to stay out of this, give kind of these commitments to the English. Yes, we're going to aid you militarily in invasion, and not actually carry it through. So these 2 conflicts have very little impact in the colonies. There isn't very little land changing. There's a lot of military blunders, planned invasions that don't go well. It makes also the colonists think that the English don't know what the hell they're doing, and the English conversely think that the colonists aren't very good as soldiers. But it did exhaust both sides, so much so that after Queen Anne's War ended in 1713, the next major conflict doesn't reach American shores for another 25 or so years, nearly a generation. So we don't see a lot of conflict in North America, but we do it in Europe. And so for that point, I mean, the sizes of the armies and the fact that there are naval and sea battles in Europe itself this kind of wears out both sides. They don't get really anywhere in North America. There isn't a lot of territory changing hands. The one exception we can actually talk about is, and let me go back to this and we will pull up the PowerPoint, open the share trade here and get this to work. There we go. The one area where we all see a little bit of territory changing hands, and let me make this slide for everyone to see it a little bit better, is right here. This is Nova Scotia. It used to be called the top corner to the very right of this map. It used to be called before this Acadia. It was a French colony going back to the 1600s. This is a concern for England. After Queen Anne's War, the English were able to, in the peace treaty, get this territory Acadia, and they renamed it Nova Scotia. And this was significant for Great Britain. The treaty ending the war gave the territory to Great Britain. There were probably 5,000 or so French Catholics living on the island of Nova Scotia, to which the English said, well, for the time being, at least you can stay. Just for the time being. However, Louis XIV, the King of England, hated losing this territory. I mean, it's a way to literally admit that your hold of Canada itself, New France, you can see it there at the top of the map, New France is becoming more and more tenuous. If the English can fortify, which they do, Nova Scotia, it's going to prove to be a threat. And as the sea lanes move, you see the Gulf of St. Lawrence, the St. Lawrence River, you can attack Quebec and then Montreal. So that's a potential problem for the French. The French did not, however, or they did, however, in this case. They lost Acadia, Nova Scotia. But they were able to reinforce the island you can see just north and east of it. That is Cape Breton Island. And at the very end of Cape Breton Island on the slide, you see what they ended up building at the aftermath of Queen Anne's War. They built this giant fortress called Louisbourg. It's begun in, I mean, it costs like the fort itself. I think I saw a statistic once. For what it cost France to run all of New France, all of their North American empire, they spent that just alone on Louisbourg. Now, the idea that, yeah, it shows you a serious investment that they're going to protect. I mean, and when Louisbourg's constructed, you can see from the New England point of view, if you were in the fishing or sea trade, you can see that Louisbourg is like a dagger. I think I have a slide of it there. There it is. I mean, we're not talking about the old Jamestown wooden fort with a bunch of trees stuck in a triangle. This is an impressive stone and masonry fort. And for the English and for the New English, the folks who live in New England, you can see that it's a potential threat to them. So we'll go back to the map again. Again, this is a map of the early campaigns of the French and Indian War, but it kind of sets the stage for the French loss of Acadia. 5,000 French now live under English control in Nova Scotia. The English also, again, rechristened the island. They fortified it, also building Halifax on the island. That became their fortress there as well. And these French continued to receive support on Nova Scotia from their countrymen in Canada. Louisbourg was built at the end of Cape Breton Island to protect France's long supply line all the way up the St. Lawrence River. If the English are able to sail their ships into the St. Lawrence, it would threaten Quebec, Montreal, and then all of New France. They just make their way, the English Navy and Army, all the way across the Great Lakes, down to the Mississippi River Valley. This is area that the French have a loose claim to. I mean, they connect the areas of New France and Canada all the way down, obviously, to what? New Orleans, which they invest in, and they move their Gulf settlements from Biloxi and Mobile, late 1600s, to what? Natchitoches, 1714, New Orleans, 1718. This is all after Queen Anne's War. So big picture, we're kind of putting it together here. And I know it seems like we're not even getting close to the revolution yet, but you've got to start this story somewhere, and we have to understand the territorial claims of the powers in North America prior to this incredibly important, significant event, the onset of the French and Indian War. So Louisbourg could defend obviously approaches to Canada. It could also harass British ships in the area, and it forced England to reckon with this position. You have to take out Louisbourg before you move into a land and sea invasion of Quebec and later Montreal, the two strongholds, both of them fortress cities in New France. In the time in between, the interim, 25 or so years, Queen Anne's War ends 1713. The next conflict will actually start in the 1730s on the American side of the Atlantic, and then it will blossom to a larger war. This will be called King George's War. But in the meantime, in the time between 1713 and the late 1730s, the Iroquois nation that was, again, 5 areas of what's now upstate New York added a 6th nation. And this is what happens when you have conflict in the different expanding British colonies. In North Carolina, the settlers in both North and South Carolina went to war against the Tuscarora Indians in North Carolina. The Tuscarora, as a result, were devastated by this conflict in the 17 teens. So this is, again, coordinated with the end of Queen Anne's War, independent of the fighting. This is just obviously a battle and fight and conflict over land and movement into new areas that the colonists want in eastern North Carolina. The Tuscarora decide we have a commonality of language with the Iroquois to the north. They up and move. I mean, they relocate. I mean, Indians did this as a result of being displaced. A lot of Indians settled in areas of eastern and later western Pennsylvania. The Tuscarora move all the way up and they become the 6th nation of the Iroquois Indians. Delegates from the Iroquois in the years in between Queen Anne's War and the next conflict also begin to become involved in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is a colony that has a very good reputation. We'll go back to the notes here with Native Americans, because think about the history of Pennsylvania. It was, again, let me pull up the sharing tray again. Here we go. Started as a colony by William Penn, who had a good reputation against with Native Americans. Try to pull the notes back up if I can. Here we go. Come on, sharing tray. There we go. Okay. Okay. And so in this area, in this reputation of peace with the Indians, the Quakers are pacifists. I mean, this is what the Penn family tries to hand down from William Penn to his son and his grandson. The problem for the Indians who live in eastern Pennsylvania is that the Iroquois in New York believe they can control the land in what's now eastern and western Pennsylvania. So this is the Delaware, Ottawa, Mingo Indians. In some ways, the Shawnee are involved as well. So they think they have more control than they actually do. This is why we have to integrate the Native American story to everything that is happening. A Pennsylvania representative begins to approach the Iroquois to extend this covenant chain, this agreement between the Iroquois 6 nations to not fight each other and by extension remain neutral, to also extend that diplomatic recognition to Indians who live in the areas of eastern Pennsylvania. They also agree to the Iroquois a land sale by which the Indians in Pennsylvania lose a great portion of their land and are forced further west because of what happens in the 1730s. It's called the walking purchase. I kid you not. It's not critical really for you to know, but what the Pennsylvania negotiators decide to do is sit down with the Indians in Pennsylvania and say, we're going to mark off land and use it for the colony of Pennsylvania. And the treaty will involve us taking land that we can only kind of survey and map out in a time it takes a man to walk about 2 days. And so what does Pennsylvania do? They find literally the 1700s equivalent of track stars. And they go out and they find folks who can cover, one guy covered nearly, I think they said 60 miles in a day. And they have like a tag team of folks.
60 or 16?
60, 60.
Oh.
Exactly, yeah. And they string a chain of runners together, and north of Philadelphia, this block of land, and the Iroquois say to the Indians who live in eastern Pennsylvania, yep, this is the agreement. And the Indians there say, this is terrible. And they say, well, this is what you have to do. You have to agree to this land transfer, the walking purchase that happens in the 1730s. So the Pennsylvania Indians are in some ways bound by the treaties that the Iroquois say, yeah, you have to kind of agree to them. You really did agree to the walking purchase, and we're going to honor it as if it's legitimate. And that pushes some of these Shawnee and Ottawa and Delaware Indians further to the west into central areas of Pennsylvania, which will later be known as part of the Ohio country. This is going to be central to our story. In 1739, that 25 years of kind of tenuous peace between England and France ends. It ends, and the conflict begins in North American waters. We call this in colonial history the War of Jenkins' Ear. It's a kind of a strange story about a British sailor who was captured by the Spanish in the Caribbean, and the Spanish authorities decided as punishment, they treated this English sailor as a pirate. So they cut his ear off. And so he kept it, he preserved it, probably in rum or something like that, and brought it back to Parliament and kind of waved it around, showing this is the way the Spanish treat legitimate sailors in their islands. And everyone in Parliament was horrified. And what begins the War of Jenkins' Ear, that's literally what it's called, in the American Caribbean, kind of an undeclared war between England and Spain, which will blossom into a much larger conflict. France will join it later, about 5 years later in 1744. It will be known as King George's War, a reference to George the First, I believe, the three Georges during the 1700s, the kings of England, first, second, and third. We obviously know King George III. He's the king when the colonies declare themselves independent. But for all intents and purposes, it's only a brief pause. The War of Jenkins' Ear, morphing into King George's War, becomes, with a brief pause, the French and Indian War. And this conflict doesn't end really until 1763. The difference with other conflicts, King William's War, Queen Anne's War, with King George's War, as it's called after 1744, involving the Spanish and the French and the English, is that they decide, the English, to invest more time and effort in what's happening on the American side of the Atlantic. They invest unprecedented amounts of men and money, and they decide to expand their empire deep into North America. And they hope when the conflict begins, they know after Queen Anne's War, it's not going to be an if, but when. And the when is 1739. That's, again, they didn't expect it to be some kind of naval war with the Spanish, but they do think they're going to go to war with France again. And that really begins in 1744. Briefly ends, no one's happy with the end of it, and it starts all over in the 1750s. So in this series of wars that really begin in 1739 and go until 1763, the English have it as their goal to literally defeat and take France off of North America as their main rival. With the initial fighting, France fears that England will try to recoup their losses. And so there's fighting on the continent. For the French, what's happening in North America is something, again, of a sideshow, considering there are these massive armies are fighting in areas of Europe, Flanders, Central Europe, areas that will be fought over again and again by European power. What's that? And again, Flanders feels, the poem from World War I, when we're talking about France and Belgium and Central Europe. So we have these giant armies fighting over there to wrestle control of that part of the world. From 1744 onward, the colonists, even though England would like to devote resources, they only have limited amount of, again, military might. They also hire mercenaries, something that they will do in a number of wars before the American Revolution. So it kind of leaves the American colonists on their own. So it means that the American colonists have to plan their own offensive operations against the French. As in the past, French Canadians and Indians begin to devastate the New England countryside. They lead raids on Maine during King George's War in the 1740s. And this, of course, very much antagonizes and we might say inspires the governor of Massachusetts, who fashions himself a military man as well. His name is William Shirley. he decides that they are going to go on the offensive, the English, after 1744. The French commander in Louisbourg, not surprisingly, Louisbourg is finished after Queen Anne's War. It's built, it is completed at the beginning of this next conflict, King George's War, 1744 to 1748. And the French governor of Canada decides, yeah, we're going to use it as a base of operations to launch attacks into New England, attack New England, American fishing boats and things like that, even attack Nova Scotia. So privateers from New France were attacking New England ships based out of Louisbourg. And this, of course, infuriated the New England settlers because this is the backbone of the economy, ever going back a century before. The seafaring trade, shipping, whaling, all of that. The seafaring, I mean, all the things you need to build the ships. The shipbuilding trade is part of the New England economy. And you could do it really inexpensively because of the vast forest in North America. So what they hoped to achieve, the English, was an overwhelming defeat of the French, and that would ensure that there would be no more attacks. Maybe even they thought they could lead a bold surprise attack against Louisbourg itself. That was going to require a combination of the British Navy, British officers in planning, along with whatever soldiers the English could spare, because unlike the French, the British typically don't keep soldiers in North America. That's something we may not recognize. The French did ever since the beginning of their colonies were started. The British rely on colonial militia. The militia are the backbone of the defensive force. They put down slave rebellions or any threats to the colony. They will, the militia in areas of Carolina, try to attack and capture Spanish Florida. During the War of Jenkins' Ear, 1740, 1741, they're unsuccessful. It's kind of a stalemate back and forth. But the militia is the military force. Anyone from 16 to 60 years of age is in the militia. Men, able-bodied. And so we don't see, and this may surprise you, we don't see soldiers by the hundreds or thousands, except during the time of war, for the British point of view, stationed in the colonies. There's a deep distrust of having soldiers in the colonies when there's no war. A peacetime army. They don't like it in England. They have to every year renew the standing army with the Militia Act, it's called. They really don't like it in the American colonies as well, because from their rationale, the army is just going to be a force that will be used to collect taxes and do other things, the bidding of the government. So this is our tradition in some ways, kind of a distrust of a large military force or standing army. So what do you do if you're some of the governors of the colonies in New England? Well, William Shirley had this idea. He rallies the militia in 1745 as the colonial royal governor, again, appointed by the king. You were in charge of the military in the colony. Now, you had to work with, of course, if the British had sent their own respective forces of the regular British Army. They often were butting heads. Shirley is somebody who said, look, you're gonna, in the English army, have to treat the American colonial officers as equals. To which the British were saying, look, a lieutenant is a higher rank than a New England colonel. Well, that's kind of bass-backwards because that's not the way it works, the ranking system in the military. So by their rationale, the English thought our lowest officer can still give orders to an elected, because the militia was, the officers were often chosen. Chosen? Ugh, what a strange, this is the way it was. What's that?
Well, they bought their titles.
In England, exactly. Yeah, in England, you paid for, your family paid for a commission in the army. So the Americans had this crazy idea that merit should maybe decide who was qualified, and those people who would often elect their officers based on a vote of the militia. Look, if you were a well-respected gentleman, if you were a successful businessman in your respected community, and you were part of that militia unit, they all might turn to you and say, you should be the regimental officer here. And the English saw that and said, this is the strangest thing we've ever seen. And the colonists said, well, your system is strange, by which you don't have an ability, you just have a family name. So Shirley had to deal with that. I mean, why can't we have our colonial militia treated as equals? What about the pay that they're going to get as well? Militia didn't really have a great reputation as being steadfast, good reliable soldiers. And King George's War is going to begin to cement stereotypical images on both sides. From the British point of view, the Americans are awful soldiers. They're fair weather soldiers. They come out when things look good, there's a chance of victory, the weather's great, the farms don't have, and crops don't have to come in. And then from the American point of view, the English are all kind of foppish. They're completely inept when it comes to not only the carrying out of strategic plans, but once the battle starts, the tactical elements as well. So a lot of that tension between the two sides we see militarily, I think, begins with King George's War, really accelerates, of course, in the French and Indian War.
Isn't it because of the English, they're used to line battles and all that, and in North America, that does not happen.
Well, yeah, there was a tactical thing as well. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, the American ranging way of war, they had known it and learned it since the time of King Philip's War in the 1670s, when the New England militia went into battle against a group of Indians and nearly wiped out really a good portion of the New England Indians. This is where they started to adopt the ways of fighting in the woods. And the English were fighting on different terrain. I mean, Flanders fields and the battles of Western Europe were supportive of more linear tactics and not the kind of, again, small skirmishing, light infantry that the Americans were a little bit used to. So that took a bit of a learning curve as well. So yeah, I mean, what's that?
It's like your rules don't apply.
Right. The rules, the idea that the rules don't apply, the way you would fight in Europe doesn't apply. But certain rules did apply, the English thought, like discipline for that. And the fact that you could use the lash. Discipline was another. How you could, again, treat infractions in the British Army. The American colonists were shocked at what they saw. They're like, oh my gosh, I mean, you could whip the bare back of a soldier who stole something, tried to run off. We would call absent without leave, AWOL now, for any minor infraction. And Shirley said, look, you can't do that to, I mean, the American militia are volunteer soldiers coming out for a campaign. You can't do that to them. And the British officers were like, the hell we can't. And they tried to. So this was an area where Shirley tried to establish something of an independent role, to his credit, for the colonial and specifically the New England militia. So this all centers back to what they're going to try to do and to reduce or capture or minimize the impact of Louisbourg. And it works. The campaign in Louisbourg in 1745, with the help of a small British naval force, these combined forces stormed and captured Louisbourg during King George's War. This is a great victory. There is a sense of pride. There were a lot of New England casualties, dead and wounded, as a result of the campaign against Louisbourg. But nevertheless, I mean, Shirley's happy, New England's happy. This is now in English hands. This is an American victory, yes, with the help of the British, but now this is no longer French. That dagger pointed from this French island directly at the heart of New England. It's done. It's in English hands. So people were thrilled about that, until they weren't thrilled about it anymore, because in the end of King George's War, when France and England negotiated an end to this conflict, once again exhausted by the scope of the fighting that mostly took place in Europe, England didn't do very well fighting in Europe. They had to get their territory back that they lost in Europe somehow. So they have to trade, as these things always happen in the negotiations at the end of the conflict. What could we give back to the French to get back what we had lost in Europe? Louisbourg. Yeah, you can imagine the popular reaction. People in England were outraged, by the way. Members of Parliament were saying this is just, I mean, it's terrible. Not arguing on behalf of the American colonists, but this was a real morale blow against the English end of this conflict, that we had to give back this very expensive and significant, strategically important fort. Now you can imagine the English side, there was frustration there, but you know, it's on the other side of the water. But the New England families who had lost sons and uncles and fathers, they were really upset about it. And it really cemented this idea that no matter what we did and sacrificed, it was irrelevant as far as the English were concerned. That's their takeaway from the end of this conflict in 1748. Yeah, exactly. The American colonies, again, didn't really receive the peace treaty very well. The English don't like it as well. I say that in the notes, and I'll just mention it again. The opposition politicians in Parliament didn't like the treaty stipulations. Again, the party that's in power, the English Parliament has political parties. Again, and when people don't like the end of a certain conflict, you can use that and say, oh, well, now we'll come to power. There's a peace party that comes in, and all that's a whole nother story. But for the English, the takeaway, and for the English colonists living in North America, the takeaway is we've had three conflicts. We've had King William's War, Queen Anne's War, King George's War, and no significant gains, and we're no closer in getting France off of the continent. They thought this was the beginning. I mean, Louisbourg into British hands would be step one. The next would be in the next conflict. They knew, like the end of Queen Anne's War, in 1748, it's not a question of if, but when. If we had Louisbourg, from there, we now launch into the St. Lawrence and capture Quebec and Montreal, and finally oust France from the continent.
And also by them defeat, like in Louisbourg, the French can enhance what happened to make it even more tougher for English to capture.
You're exactly right, and this is where the story's going to go heading. I mean, the French see the writing on the wall that they had to, getting this back was critical. Louisbourg. Yeah.
French, because they could like control the more, like be more in control of what can happen now, because they learned from their mistakes. Right,
exactly. And now everyone's kind of in agreement over where the conflict might shift on the map. So the English realize they're going to have to, if there's another conflict, reduce and capture Louisbourg all over again, which they actually end up doing in the French and Indian War. And the French begin to say, our hold of the interior of the continent, the area that's going to be the focus of the start of the French and Indian War, is vulnerable as well. And that's where we enter the story about, we could call it the Ohio country, the area of the West. So that's where we're going to shift gears a little bit. Eastern Pennsylvania Indians, as a result of a couple of the treaties that had taken place in the 1730s and 1740s, begin to move to an area in the West. It's an area known as the Ohio country. There's a question about whether or not this is actually owned by the English, the Indians, or the French. And that's why things get a little bit, again, unknown. There's a great unknown. Let me show you the area that we're talking about here. Again, very quickly, at the end of, just to orient everybody, at the end of King George's War, 1748, this is the way the map looks. As far as the different European rivals and their claims in North America, the British have a sliver of control from New England all the way down to Georgia, which is the newest colony that was started in the 1730s. Spain maintains a hold of Florida's, I should say, the part of the Panhandle and a peninsula. New France looks impressive on paper, but it is Quebec, Montreal, and forts all along the areas of the Mississippi River connecting down to New Orleans. Again, the population is greatly different. In 1750, there are 1.5 million English colonists in North America, 75,000 French. 1.5 million, 75,000. So this giant swath of green looks more impressive on a map than the reality behind it. And that's why the French and the English begin to understand that this area here, this is the Ohio country. Now, modern boundaries, we're talking about Western Virginia, Pennsylvania, and even Maryland. You can see Fort Cumberland will be built in Maryland. The other problem working, to confuse the story a little bit, but not too much, is that none of the English colonies, when they were created, few of the English colonies, had a western boundary. So Virginia's western boundary was technically the Pacific Ocean, California, which could be awkward, obviously. Maryland and Pennsylvania as well. they wouldn't work out these rival Western claims to the land. I mean, look at that. Is that Massachusetts claiming? Yeah, Michigan.
Wouldn't that be New York since it's right? Because
Which area? Near the Great Lakes?
it's not.
Yeah,
It's right. It's closer than Massachusetts.
right. Yeah, these were a mess. I mean, look, Connecticut. How can they have a Western land claim in what's now northern Ohio, Indiana, Illinois?
Honestly, I don't even want to think of the legal paperwork behind this.
Exactly. The legal story is that there was no line to the west where the colonies ended. So this is why when we're talking about
Oh, okay.
this area, we've got nothing short of 3 colonies involved claiming this area. Now, the Ohio country, the area that we will call Western Pennsylvania, Maryland, parts of Ohio, it's the size of France, just to give you a scope and scale here. So this is an impressive amount of territory. And both the French out of Canada and the English out of Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Maryland realized this could be ground zero for the next conflict. And in fact, it actually is. France, in the aftermath of the last colonial war, realized that they probably will try to lean on Indian allies, but whether or not that will be possible is still unknown. When the Indians in eastern Pennsylvania, when they start to move, again, closer towards the Allegheny River and the Allegheny Mountains in western Pennsylvania, that kind of creates a situation where Indians who lived in eastern Pennsylvania and Delaware move further to the west. Again, an area that the Iroquois claim we control, even though the Delaware and other Indians say, well, not so fast with that whole idea. Pennsylvania traders begin to move in as well, and they're going to bring and supply the Delaware Indians and the Western Pennsylvania Indians, or the Ohio country Indians, with supplies. So when the traders and trappers move in, the question is going to be inevitably, do the settlers move next? And that's why these 3 colonies have to get control of it, make sure they establish it. It is British territory. It is the territory of, well, whatever colony is going to be dominant. And also, if they keep the French out, they can control it for future generations. That's why you see on the map the indication of the Ohio Company, which we're going to talk about in a second. If the colonists follow, this is from the French point of view, trappers, traders out towards the Allegheny River. If it's British and not French, they get control of the area. Will it be just inevitable that the English control the southern Great Lakes and cut off the French from Canada all the way down to Mississippi to their areas of what? Natchez, New Orleans, Natchitoches. So this is where both parties are very concerned after 1748. From the Indian point of view, they want to show a lot of independence from the Iroquois. Again, they're frustrated by the walking purchase and the treaties that had taken place in the 1740s. They accept, due the Pennsylvania Indians' English influence in the area, and begin to speak to Virginia representatives on their own after 1748, ignoring their so-called loyalty to the Iroquois Confederacy. What had you done for us? Nothing much at all as far as the Ohio country Indians were concerned. Because they're more desperate, are the French after 1748, they send out expeditions to begin to investigate the area south of Lake Erie. That's where you see the construction of these 3 green forts marked on the map. The situation is that the Indians are surly. Their allegiance to France is more and more in question as the English move in. The French may have some advantages in negotiating with Indian allies, but the English have an advantage. They can bring more goods to trade with Indian groups, and that greases the wheels of diplomacy. The French supply line is longer. It's got to go through the St. Lawrence River, and they just don't bring the volume of items. So this is what causes and piques the concern of the French. The French colonial governor out of New Canada, out of France, out of New France, decides, okay, maybe we have to find a way to actually slow down what's going to be an inevitable move by the English traders, trappers, followed by swarms of their colonists. And then it's game over. We've lost the Ohio country to the English. More troubling for the French is that a group of wealthy investors and connected tobacco planters in Virginia established in 1749 the Ohio Company. The formal name is the Ohio Company of Virginia. Reference to the river, obviously, the Ohio River, which is the key to the continent. You can see when you gain access, especially where these rivers come together, you control the access to the continent. The Ohio River then goes what? West of the Mississippi River, and that's it. You've got the interior of the continent. That's it, exactly. Exactly. You're not going to be able, you can reach the south by sea, but you're not going to be able to connect the interior parts. A Great Lake connection to the Mississippi and then to areas south. Following a policy that we would recognize, right? The French would call it containment. Contain the English. When you saw the map, the green area of the map that was New France, it looks impressive, but it's not all that impressive because the control of that is very tenuous because you got 75,000 French and 1.5 million English. That's why the Indians control the balance of power as far as the French are concerned. So the Ohio Company, started by 20 or so wealthy tobacco planters in Virginia. One of them is the lieutenant governor of the colony, kind of acting often as the governor when the royal governor isn't in place in Virginia. And they began to extend their influence and control by building forts, one of them being Fort Cumberland in what's now Western Maryland. The other ones will be built a little bit later, Fort Necessity, obviously, by Washington and his soldiers at the beginning of this conflict. The French governor of Canada sees the actions of Pennsylvania and Virginia as a threat. It's a two-pronged assault as far as he's concerned over clearly French territory. The English believe the Ohio country is clearly English territory. He didn't realize, the governor of Canada, that it is Pennsylvania and Virginia. These are bitter rivals for control. Where is this territory? Well, we can easily say now the forks of the Ohio is Pennsylvania, but that wasn't clear in 1749. And look on the map. Well, we've got the mountain boundaries here. So like a lot of colonies, there are more rivalries than unity in the North American story. Again, they govern themselves independently. Yes, they owe allegiance to Great Britain, but you know, it's one of those stories of when there's a conflict, the quickest answer when North Carolina asks for help from South Carolina says, what's in it for us? I mean, literally. Massachusetts asked New York for militia to repel the invasions of the French and French allied Indians, and New York says, nah, our frontiers are threatened too, so we're not going to help. I mean, this idea of a colonial unity among 13, really 14 colonies, if you count Nova Scotia, you know, isn't really there. It's not an existing narrative, and I don't think the governor of French Canada knew that. He didn't know that these folks, these governors, were butting heads over which colony. I mean, if you control the Ohio country, the Ohio Company from Virginia or Pennsylvania, that's going to matter, because the family is going to get to use that land and enrich themselves and their own future generations. Pennsylvania traders begin to lead the way in the Ohio country in the late 1740s and the early 1750s. It's a real estate investment, the Ohio Company, and so Virginia wants to, again, lease the land, sell the land to their kids and grandkids, and they expect it to take that long till the settlers start moving into that area. They'll be able to expand tobacco plantations. Well, not really. The climate doesn't support it, but they didn't realize that just yet. But they can lease and sell the land. It'll be cleared by Virginia slaves, and it will continue the wealth and perpetuate Virginia as one of the most important and significant colonies. So the legislature of Virginia gives permission. We're going to go back to the notes here. They allow the company. And then the Virginia legislature is controlled by who? Stockholders in the Virginia Company or the Ohio Company. Big shock right there. So they literally give permission to say, all right, we'll go back and make sure we're sharing this with everybody so can see it. Okay, there we go. Nope, that's not it. Sorry. Okay. There it is. All right, let's get set here and where we are with the notes. Right, the legislature of Virginia tells the Ohio Company that they can acquire the land at the forks, the all-important strategic forks. 3 rivers come together. Any of you are football fans? 3 rivers, they built a stadium there. It's what? What city? It's Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Yeah. Back when the Steelers played in the 70s and 80s, I guess up to the pretty recently. It's the confluence of 3 rivers. Exactly. So both the French and the English are targeting the same area. They know the forks, the 3 rivers coming together, is going to be central to control of the Ohio country. So it's the legislature of Virginia, the government within Virginia itself. This is independent of what's happening in England. I mean, it's the basically governor of the colony of Virginia saying, all right, we're going to go out there and establish English legitimacy there after 1749. Eventually, you would have families set up there. There'd be a move out west, and this area would be given and controlled by the Virginia colony. You also have to get permission to buy. Again, the company has to get permission by the colony to establish some kind of trading post, or if even better, a fort. Trading posts are beginning. This is where Indians can gather allies of the English in Virginia. And then that, of course, strengthen the English claim to the Ohio country. Governor Dinwiddie, who is the lieutenant governor, effectively the governor of Virginia, Dinwiddie, yeah, that's his name, hears that the French had already started construction of 3 forts. We'll go back to the notes again. I know I'm pulling these up. Here we go. 3 forts built from the southern shores of Lake Erie. This is when he thinks, okay, we've got to make this sooner rather than later proposition. Here they are. Fort Presque Island on the southern shore of Lake Erie. This is the aftermath of King George's War. So 1748-49, they start building these forts. Fort Le Boeuf, I believe that's been the pronunciation, and Fort Venango. They're also have intentions of building one further south, literally on the forks of the Ohio, later to be called Fort Duquesne. He writes his superiors, does the lieutenant governor of Virginia, and asks for direction. What do we do next? If these forts from the French, the green on the map, get extended further south, France's containment policy will become a reality. So in this story, we introduce George Washington, finally in 1748 and afterward, lest we forget his role in colonial history. This slide, this painting, it's too funny. You wouldn't know it from this painting, but George Washington is not a monument or someone on the dollar bill. He is a human being, more than just a face on American currency. Briefly, because we're going to talk about him a lot, obviously, in this class. He's the center of the story in many ways and makes the revolution possible. His family tree goes back 5 centuries. He can trace it to England. So that would take him to the 13th century, the 1200s. They are, in their entire history, neither highborn nor particularly poor on the social scale. They are above most of the common people in England, and they are loyal, fiercely loyal to, going back to Henry VIII, going back to taking sides with the royalists or the king during the English Civil War in the 1600s. Remember, you have the Puritans, the Cavaliers versus the Roundheads, the English Civil War that takes place in the 1640s. Actually, it's the English Civil War that leads the Washingtons to come over to the New World. Washington's colonial ancestor is John Washington. He comes over, leaving the unrest in England during the decade from about 1648 until when the king comes back, and makes his way to Virginia. Arrives here in 1648 just as the colony had been passing through a lot of its growing pains, the initial 50 or so years where the death rate was alarming, but by 1658 things are a little bit more settled. Tobacco as a cash crop is booming in Virginia. And that's how he gets involved, settling in Eastern Virginia. John Washington, the colonial ancestor of George Washington, was followed later by his brother Augustine, and two of them began to accumulate land in slaves in Eastern Virginia. This was handed down to his grandson, Augustine, kept the same name as his grandfather. Augustine is the father of George Washington. We'll talk about this painting in a minute because it's interesting about when it was painted and why it was painted. Augustine married Jane Butler, and they had 2 sons. So Washington would have half brothers. Jane died, Augustine's first wife, and he remarried Mary Ball. That's George Washington's mother. So again, same father, different mothers. Their first of 7 children, not uncommon in the colonial period, Mary Ball and Augustine Washington, was born in 1732 in February. That's in George's birthday. They moved to Ferry Farm in Eastern Virginia. 7 of Augustine's 9 children lived to adulthood. What did that mean for George? He wasn't getting anything. Let's talk about this painting very briefly. This was painted in 1939. The artist is Grant Wood. I bet you know his other famous painting. Anyone hear of American Gothic?
Oh, yeah.
The 2 farmers, husband and wife, one's holding the pitchfork, standing in front of, yeah.
I can see there was. Yeah.
This is the same artist. We know a little bit about the story. The gentleman to the right is Parson Weems. Parson Weems wrote the story of George Washington cutting down the cherry tree. Now, this is, again, hysterical when you look at it. George Washington, if you can see it in the slide, has an adult face on a child's body. It's a way to emphasize, Parson Weems said, that Washington, for some reason, cut down a cherry tree on his father's property. And when he asked him who did it, he said, "I cannot tell a lie. I did it." And the father was very forgiving and said, "Okay," although he's looking very angry in this painting. You can see there's actually, if you see the grip, he has a death grip on the tree. There's actually red on his hands from maybe squeezing it too hard. Slaves in the background, possibly picking cherries or another fruit on the farm of Washington's father. But it was painted 1939, so we talked about how the setting of what's happening in the country matters about how people wrote history. 1939, and even pulling the curtain back as if to unveil this as a story. The cherry tree story probably didn't happen, but the guy who wrote about it, Parson Weems, thought it was important to establish that Washington, the father of our country, couldn't tell a lie. And the artist said, we should celebrate our past. And Washington is, again, painted from Washington in his painting is the Gilbert Stuart portrait that was done, one of the more recognizable adult paintings of George Washington. So 1939, what do you have? It's the year World War II starts, but you have the rise of global fascism. You've got it happening in Italy, obviously, in Germany, and also in Japan. Japan had been running across China, the rape of Nanking in the 1930s. Obviously, what's happening with Hitler acquiring territory in Europe, with Mussolini, invasions of Ethiopia. So this was critical as part of the story for Grant Wood to paint this scene. And again, it's a little bit surreal. It's a little bit interesting the way he chose the lines and colors in it. But anyway, so Washington, let's get back to his story. His father, Augustine, died when George was 11. That meant the bulk of his property was going to go to the sons of his first marriage, and specifically George's half-brother. George's half-brother, he had a couple of important influences, did Washington, in his early life. Obviously, one would be his father, but he only lived until George was 11. The other was his half-brother, Lawrence. Lawrence Washington was going to inherit most of his father's estate and slaves and land in Virginia. With very little money and several kids, Mary, the widow now, Washington's mother, could not send him to a formal education at really the only place of some kind of formal education in Virginia, the College of William and Mary, which had been established in the late 1600s, really the first major university in the South. There were a couple in New England, Harvard and Yale, I think are their names. They're part of the Ivy League. William and Mary, obviously named after the co-monarchs. So Washington had an education that was done on his own, probably less than, we think of who's the president who learned by reading books by the fireplace, Lincoln. We think he didn't have a formal education. He didn't. Washington even had less of an education than Lincoln. He learned to write, he learned to spell, write in cursive. He would have been effectively homeschooled, maybe by some tutors that were shared by his other siblings. He read classics, Don Quixote, Tristram Shandy, everyone read Lawrence Sterne in the later part of the 1700s. They loved that English author. So his father was an influence up until his death, his half-brother Lawrence, who he absolutely idolized, Lawrence Washington. And then his other influence was a book that he committed to memory and made the framework of his life. And that is the rules of conduct and politeness. And this isn't just making it up to tell a fun story, but this was Washington's shaping influence. There were 110 precepts or rules for conduct in a book that was written at the end of the 16th century or the 1500s. It was to educate the French nobility, the rules of conduct and politeness. 110 maxims. One was dedicated to God. Only one, apparently. 60 were dedicated to politeness and 20 to cleanliness. And that's what he knew about. Things like, again, don't laugh too hard, don't pick your teeth at the dinner table, how to hold yourself in conversation, not to be the center of attention, to obviously spread your time with dinner guests. Again, politeness and civility. These were his guiding principles in his life. So the book covered everything that someone who was a middling, not wealthy, but not poor, a middling Virginia Tidewater adolescent would need to know about self-discipline. And it was always for Washington a work in progress to have self-discipline. It talked about table manners, dress, how you conducted yourself in front of your social betters, the ideas of moderation and modesty. Don't be drunk in public. Again, give attention to those who are lower on the social ladder and don't condescend to them. Oh, isn't that nice? You're poor. You have to be polite and understand that if you were to better yourself and have ambitions for political office, you have to recognize people of different social orders. His half-brother Lawrence was someone that Washington looked up to. Lawrence fought in the British Navy. So Washington immediately thought, this is my career path. This is what I'm going to do to better myself. In fact, Lawrence named his estate on the Potomac River for the British admiral that he served under. His name was Admiral Vernon, later to call the home Mount Vernon. Washington would inherit it, but later. This was Lawrence's farm and plantation. Later, Lawrence Washington became the adjutant general, kind of a high-ranking officer in the Virginia militia. Again, this isn't a commission in the British Army. This is a rank given by the colony of Virginia. He also was elected as a member of the House of Burgesses, which is the Virginia Assembly. The Virginia Assembly, the House of Burgesses, had been around since the 1600s. It's the first colonial assembly in the New World. And so it's what anyone who was a military veteran, well-respected, of comfortable income, not super wealthy, as Lawrence Washington would have been. And then Lawrence Washington did something very smart. He married into the Fairfax family. They were very wealthy and very well connected in Virginia, the Fairfax family. George decided to follow his older half-brother. Ingratiate yourself to the Fairfax family. Connections matter. Washington learned how to be a gentleman and to also keep his mouth shut. Didn't talk much, listened a lot, and became a respected teenager. He wanted to start a career in the Navy. His mother wouldn't let him. Imagine if that had worked out differently. Washington is an officer in the British Navy. His mother said, you can't possibly do it. I need you here to manage the farm. You can't be stationed in God knows where, and forbade that decision. So instead, Washington had to settle on the possibility of also getting some commission in the Virginia Regiment. He was never going to get an actual commission in the British Army because he was an American. He was a provincial. Those went out to connected families in England, not to Americans as they came to be known during King George's War. So George prospered not as a soldier early on, but in a profession that was, I think, uniquely suited to him. He was a surveyor. I'll show you a slide here of Washington. You know, the folks who study Washington in some detail wanted to recently make him seem much more human, and so they did these reconstructions of him. This is at Mount Vernon. When they built the larger museum around Washington's home, one of the things they want to do is create a person that can be related to. Here he is as a late teenager, probably 18, 19 years old here. He prospered as a surveyor. Again, you just look at the dollar bill, the Washington, you saw the monuments and everything, and you know, this is why that painting was funny. We only picture him as a fully grown adult. Even on a child's body, he's got that face when he's in his 50s or 60s when he was as president. But here's how he would have looked younger. I mean, this is college undergraduate age, 18, 19 years old. He had a natural eye for land, so he really prospered as a surveyor. He could spend hours on horseback. He was known as one of the most athletic individuals. That's what athleticism meant, the ability to look good riding a horse, because it takes some effort to do that. You have to be pretty physically strong. He was paid good wages for being a surveyor. He was paid sometimes in cash, sometimes he was paid in land. By the time he's 21 years old, he has 1,400 acres of land. Pretty good. By this time, Washington also grew to his adult size, possibly 6'2". We think he might have been taller, which is a half a head at least taller than anybody else in the middle of the 1700s. Light blue eyes, reddish brown hair, not white, not in a wig. He would wear a wig later on, but he would just kind of just pull his hair back that way. He had a long nose, and his face, if you had seen this a little bit closer and seen Washington in his 20s, would have been pitted with smallpox scars, which he got and survived when he actually had made a trip to Barbados earlier in his life. When he turns 20, his teeth start falling out. Hygiene of your teeth apparently wasn't that important back then. He didn't get wooden teeth. He later would fiddle relentlessly with ivory teeth. Some of them were taken from slaves on his farms and plantations. So as a result, those kind of rudimentary dentures, as his teeth rotted and started to fall out, made it very difficult for him to smile, and he was very self-conscious about his teeth, so he didn't smile much at all.
Also, I think at that museum, you were talking about, if I'm remembering correctly, because I was in 8th grade, but they showed, like, I think his teeth, I think.
Yes, yeah, they're over there. They absolutely are. Yeah, you can see them.
It was kind of weird.
And you can see it. It's metal, literally, with the teeth that he needed to fit his existing teeth. So this would have been, I mean, you know, it's not like modern. I've no experience with dentures or wearing false teeth of any kind, but they're probably a much comfortable process as opposed to what they would have been back then. Again, rusty metal in there, and just the pain of operating them just to eat and to talk, and yeah, so there was all that. But that's the other myth of Washington, the wooden teeth. Why would you put wood in your mouth? It's 100% humidity. You know, what is your body temperature? About 100 degrees. It's not going to last very long. So the teeth are going to rot pretty quickly. Okay, so that's a good introduction to Washington. We'll take the story very quickly back to the Ohio country, and this sets up what we're going to talk about and how Washington is involved with the Ohio country and the start of the French and Indian War. The Peace of 1748 is pretty short-lived. The factor in between the French and the English in the Ohio country is obviously the Iroquois. Can they control the Indians of Pennsylvania and the Ohio country? There are 12,000 in the Iroquois League. About 2,000 of them are warriors. This doesn't sound like an impressive amount, but it's as much as any French army can be put in the field in the 1740s and 50s. They control the Iroquois, the passages in between Albany and Montreal, along the Mohawk River Valley in New York. If there's going to be invasion points of North America, either by the French moving into New York to the Ohio country or the British out of the Ohio country towards Canada, they will need the adherence, they will need the alliance of the Iroquois. But because they have, and we've gone over some of this already, more English colonists on the ground than French, the French decide we're scattered, we have to make more efforts. We have to triple, quadruple the effort the English are making of Indian allies. We have to do even better. And in some ways they had. You know, English has 1.5 million, the English have 1.5 million colonists maybe there, but they are marginally in control of these 14 distinct colonies, if you include Nova Scotia. They don't cooperate in defense. We're going to see in the beginning portion of the French and Indian War an effort to try to put together some maybe grand colonial legislative government. There are two things you need to know. There's no colony-wide assembly. You might think, oh, there's a colony, there's a Congress of the Colonies, right? Representative from every colony meets somewhere, like in a city in Boston, New York, Philadelphia. Nope, doesn't exist. So the English have a problem where the colonies govern themselves. That means they're not going to unite or may not unite when there's a common enemy. So in some ways it benefits the English, right? If the colonists are jealous of each other over something like the Ohio country, they won't do anything like, I don't know, unite against England. there's not a snowball chance of hell of that taking place. But at the same time, it's going to be difficult to put aside their jealousies and differences and combine against the impending threat of the French. I mean, if you are in Massachusetts, you don't give a whit about what's happening in the Ohio country. And if you're in South Carolina, you might not care either because you have a powerful force of Cherokee Indians on your frontier. So who the hell cares about what's happening in this distant Ohio country? So the French are dissipated along the continent. There are, again, a fraction of their number as compared to the English. That's why they have to rely on Indian allies. From its early days, the French established control of the regions of Canada with an army. The English think, well, we have more people, we can kind of neglect Indian policy. And so what they do have the advantage, I've kind of mentioned this earlier in the lecture, is the idea that they can bring more guns, presents, and feasts before the campaign. The French can do that as well, and they've been working on it ever since they established their colony in Quebec in 1608. But the English had kind of said, no, we didn't take it really. By force, we can kind of dictate policy. And they realized, no, that maybe not the best way anymore. The French are going to court Native Americans on their side, even the balance of power. We have to do something else. We have to bring more goods, more ability to feast and to basically inundate Indian allies with goods, trade goods, and the items that they need. We have to renew these agreements of neutrality. Those conferences happen in places like Albany in the 1750s. So the French control is kind of scattered. It is dependent on lightly built forts from Canada all the way south to New Orleans, the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys. Maybe the English and the French would value the Indian allies if one can get control of the other. In 1750, the Indians face a really serious threat. The threat is from an invasion from mostly the English, and the English have to address that. It is English settlers who are moving into lands in the Ohio country. The British have the one advantage: they can bring in more and superior trade goods. So this all centers on, just to wrap up for today and link what we're going to do Thursday, and we'll talk about that in just a second. Why would we bring in Washington into the story? Well, Washington, we now know, is connected. He knows the Fairfax family. The Fairfax family knows the Lieutenant Governor Dinwiddie. Washington is an investor in the Ohio Company. So when you need someone to go out and tell the French, who are eyeing the forks of the Ohio, that is Virginia territory, whereby English territory, you can't continue your string of forts to the south. It is Dinwiddie who picks Washington, and Washington is more than thrilled to go. He's 21 years old. He's able. He's ambitious. Denied the ability to go into the British Navy. Maybe he can actually get, and he's in fact given a commission in the Virginia Company as a major of the Virginia Volunteers. He doesn't speak any French. They kind of get around that. He has no experience with negotiating on a high level with the French representatives who are no doubt going to be near the forks of the Ohio. But he has the backing of the Fairfax family. He knows terrain very well. He's a surveyor, and also he's young enough so that they think he'll survive the trip, which almost kills him the first one he goes out. He's going to go out a couple times, and this will link us to where we're going to take the next part of the story. Let me say a couple of things about the rest of this week. Obviously, everyone's, I'm going to stop the recording so we can just do that really quickly, and then we'll talk to everybody all together. Nope. I'm going to figure this out. There we go. Stop recording. There we go.